You're watching Inside Utah Politics.
Time now for a closer look at the career of Senator Orrin Hatch with the Inside Utah Politics panel. This week we have local historian Ron Fox and University of Utah Associate Professor Tim Chambliss. Gentlemen, great to have you with us. On point with the wardrobe today. I've got to say, this was not planned. You two just showed up this way.
That's right. That's right. It's a red and blue combination.
Yeah, the nonpartisan, right?
That's
right. Okay, let's go ahead and get right into this because we have some time, but still, how do you summarize a career that goes 42 years? Let's start with life before politics, Ron. What was Senator Hatch, what was the makeup of his life before he ran for Senate?
Well, he talks many times about growing up in a chicken coop and came from a family that was not very wealthy. He had 8 brothers and sisters. I lost 2 early and then lost his oldest brother in World War II. But he was always, pushing out there and leading in his family, and he ended up coming to Utah in 1969, going to BYU, and then he went back to Pittsburgh and spent a number of years there, and then came back to Salt Lake, and I think he had a good idea of trying to take on a 3-term incumbent senator by the name of Frank Moss, and was successful.
Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about how those early days shaped him later on in life. Your thoughts there?
Highly motivated, upward bound, lost a brother, World War II, always hungry, wanted to get politically involved. And in coming to Utah, starting as a young law practice, he was already thinking about politics. We know that 2 years, at age 40, 2 years before the 1976 election, he was already thinking about challenging 3-term incumbent Frank Moss.
Let's talk more about that because, as you mentioned, he came out of being a litigation attorney.
Yep.
He wasn't involved necessarily at the county level, at the state level. So this is a first-time politician coming in to take on that 3-term incumbent. How did he get that job done in an underdog capacity?
He was very motivated. He saw an opening. He really had no serious competitors for the Republican Party nomination, and he was able to raise doubts about a senator being now in his 70s, who maybe had served too long, 18 years. What do you call a senator when they're too long? Call him home.
Yeah, and you kind of look back at that and you think, boy, that's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, Senator Hatch will have served a little over 41 years when he leaves office in January, and he beat Reed Smoot's record, who was 30 years in the Congress, and it is extremely rare to have anyone in the Congress for that long. He is the longest-serving Republican senator in the history of the United States.
Sets the record for longevity for the state of Utah. Every day he serves as a senator, he sets the record for Republicans. Has not served as long as Bob Byrd or Ted Kennedy, but indeed, half his life has been in the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, pretty amazing when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
Let's go back to this first election. It was a fairly close one, considering how he, won later on in life. But talk about the dynamic of taking on Senator Moss.
Well, anytime you take on a U.S. senator who's an incumbent, and in those years prior to Senator Hatch running, it was a pretty Democratic state. And you had a situation with, you had just come out of Watergate, a couple of years, so it was still a tough go for Republicans, but he won with 54% of the vote. And then in every other succeeding election through his life, he built on that. The highest one was 69%.
Right. Indeed, in 1976, Utah, 3 of the 4 members of the Congressional delegation were Democratic. We had Democratic governor, 3-term Governor Cal Rampton. Republicans were seen to be the minority, the underdog. And the Moss campaign really didn't see him coming. He filed the last hour of the last day possible to be a candidate, May 10th of 1976.
So would you credit him then for this pendulum swing to Republican Utah?
Well, you certainly added to it. I mean, you did see a real major shift in the late 70s and early 80s to Republican office holders. Scott Matheson followed Governor Rampton, but once he left, then it became a Republican surge.
We even saw at one point of his career where he made a run for the presidency.
Yes, that's in 1999-2000. I might mention in 1976, he got the endorsement of former Governor California Governor Ronald Reagan, and that's what helped him win the September 1976 primary, go on to defeat Senator Moss. Orrin Hatch wanted to be president. He ran early 2000 until it was evident that he wasn't going to win, and bowed out and endorsed George W. Bush.
One of the things I remember most of that is Karl Malone campaigning for Senator Hatch to be president.
Yes, well, which was rather interesting because a lot of us had gotten involved with the Bush campaign, and it caused us to sort of pause, if you know what I mean. Our governor and that, you know, when you have your own U.S. senator as a favorite son, it causes a little bit of a glitch when a number of us had already endorsed and were working on establishing the Bush campaign.
How far did he go with that presidential campaign?
He only got 1% in the polls, and so his campaign really never took off.
Okay.
His love for the presidency was, I think, only second to his desire to be on the Supreme Court.
That's right.
Let's talk more about that, because there was a time in his career that he did think, you know, maybe the nation's highest court is the route I want to go.
He had actually even tried to be a federal district court judge when he was in Pennsylvania. But coming to Utah in 1988, when Robert Bork had been rejected, when David Ginsburg was no longer a candidate, and there was an opening there, he was on the short list in the Reagan administration, second term.
Absolutely.
So what ultimately ended up getting him to the point where that didn't work out and he stayed put in the Senate?
He did. I think it wasn't the option there for him as a direct line, and if I'm not mistaken, it was Clarence Thomas that got that nomination. Or was it before
Anthony
that?
Kennedy.
Anthony Kennedy, that's right.
1988 February.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on to some of the legislation, widely considered landmark. What are the top accomplishments that you see legislation-wise when you look back at Senator Hatch's career?
When we look at the fact that he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, chairman of the Finance Committee, Health and Education, Intelligence Committee, that as chairman he affected the agenda. Here in Utah, the large facility on the southwest corner of this valley, National Security Agency, is there principally because of Orrin Hatch.
Orrin did bring home the bacon, so to speak, as we would call it, and he was very pro-Utah. There was nobody who was better with us getting the Olympic Games and for the amounts of money that we got in the support of infrastructure, security, you know, all of the various venues, and he was just a really good cheerleader out there for this state.
Is there anyone who can take a look at his career and say, there's nothing he did that I didn't like?
Well, didn't like. Sometimes some of his positions could alienate. I mean, in 1977, as a brand new senator, he was not that friendly to gays and lesbians. But he will come around by 1990 to be a major sponsor of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which most people don't know, except those in the disability community, how much of a friend he has been to people with special needs.
And the whole CHIP program that he worked with Senator Kennedy on, and got criticized sometimes within the Republican Party for his work there, but he and Ted developed a really good personal relationship. And in that, they were able to accomplish something. The White House put out a statement yesterday saying that Orrin Hatch has passed more bills than any other member of Congress in its history. And that's a big mouthful.
Yeah, and it's somewhere around 800 pieces of legislation.
You know, we're talking about a man who, we think of him as a senator for 42 years, but a candidate also for president, but also wanting to be on the Supreme Court. He's basically transcending three branches of government.
Okay, let's bring it full circle. On Friday, he was honored with the Medal of Freedom. Put that into perspective for us. What does that mean?
Well, the Medal of Freedom, which was created by John F. Kennedy in his last year as president, it's an honor that has been given only to one other Utahn that I know of, and that's Gordon B. Hinckley by President George W. Bush. And President Benson received one, but it was a citizen's medal. But it is the highest honor that can be given to a United States citizen, and the only other item that's out there is the Congressional Gold Medal that is given to members of our society for their contributions to the betterment of our society.
Tim, when you break down his career, how do Utah Democrats in general perceive the senator's career?
Definitely right of center to very right. For the most part, Utah Democrats have been fairly unhappy with Orrin Hatch because they've been beaten by Orrin Hatch. Yet all things considered, given the shift of the Republican Party to the very far right, increasingly Senator Hatch has been seen as a moderate among Democrats. So Democrats very often have ended up voting for him in recent elections.
How about Utah Republicans?
Utah Republicans, they're primarily very positive about Orrin. Sometimes you'll get the fringes, both liberals and conservative Republicans, that will take shots at him. But overall, he is shown by his re-election efforts. And in his 41 years as a member of the Senate, he has now risen to be the president pro tem of the Senate, which is third in line to the presidency. Yeah. And so he has a detail that travels with him and will until January 3rd for security purposes. But he is a very likable, very principled, and an easy person to chat with.
All right, we are going to have to end it on that note. I see you had another thought, but unfortunately we have run out of time. Appreciate your time here, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Stay with us. We'll be right back with more Inside Utah Politics right after the break.